Good afternoon, everyone. How are you today? Thank you very much for joining us for this important event at NYU. So we really appreciate your presence here. Thank you for your time. I want to thank you, NYU, New York University, and the Brademas Center for making this possible, for organizing this event on this important issue we are about to talk about, which is Venezuela. So before we get started, I would like to have a quick show of hands. Has anyone from the audience traveled to Venezuela or is from Venezuela? Great, because we look forward to your comments and your questions later on. So we have a wonderful panel today. We are going to address the situation of Venezuela right now. And I'm very fortunate to be moderating this panel with so amazing experts on Venezuela and these issues in the region. So we have here the presence of Miriam Kornblith, who is from Venezuela. She's very active on these issues. And we also have, she's not representing National Endowment for Democracy, but she works for the National Endowment for Democracy. Thank you very much. And we also have Mr. Michael Shifter, who is the president of the Inter-American Dialogue. And finally, we have the presence of Cynthia Arnson, who is from the Wilson Center. So we are about to have this very interesting discussion on Venezuela because we need to address the current situation that is going on in the South American country right now. So first, I would like to start with Miriam, who is from Venezuela, and she's been working on these aspects for a long time. And we like her to give us her assessment on the current situation and the state of affairs in Venezuela. Also, we are going to take advantage of her electoral background, and maybe she can share her insights on the elections that Venezuela has had and how these elections and these processes have led to the current situation we find ourselves. So I think it's going to be really interesting, and later on we are going to have some questions from the audience. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Miriam, for participating in this interesting conversation.
So thank you very much, Geovanny, and I'm delighted to be in this panel with my very good friends, Cindy and Michael. And well, thank you very much for coming, because we know this is a difficult day. I mean, prior to Passover, prior to Holy Friday, so we appreciate you being here. Well, very briefly, if we want to focus on elections in Venezuela, that's obviously it's a critical matter. And part of what is going on in the country right now is very clearly associated with elections. The last, I would say, kind of decent election, I don't think we can even call it decent, but the last election whereby the opposition felt there was at least a slight opportunity for a competitive race took place in December 2015, and that was the opportunity whereby the opposition won the National Assembly, and that triggered a totally new and different political dynamic in the country. Once the government realized that through elections they could really be kicked out of power, the whole political and electoral dynamic changed drastically. Until 2015, we could characterize the Venezuelan regime from the political perspective as a competitive authoritarian regime, increasingly authoritarian with very significant violations of human rights, but in the strictly electoral and say electoral sphere, until that point it did qualify as an electoral authoritarian regime, which means a regime that is authoritarian, however, uses elections as a way to enter power, remain in power, and allows for a significant, though very controlled, political competition. After those elections where the opposition won the National Assembly, the government openly, clearly, very explicitly decided not to hold elections that could have any kind of competitive dimension that could at some point allow the opposition to displace the government to win an election. And the immediate proof of this decision was the totally blocking the recall referendum that the opposition tried to activate in 2016. In contrast to what had happened in 2004 when there was a recall referendum against President Chavez that was also filled with tricks and obstacles and all sorts of distortions in terms of a free, fair, competitive election. However, even within that very diminished quality, that referendum took place. In 2016, the government simply did not want to run the risk of not even allowing for gathering the 20% signatures that were needed to call for this referendum. And after that, the government staged this very phony process, which was to elect this National Constituent Assembly. The opposition did not participate in that election. Then after that, there were the governor's elections, and at the end of 2017, there was a lot of discussion among the opposition whether to participate or not. And finally, the presidential election that took place in May 2018, whereby the opposition decided not to participate. So this, and well, we can also take a look at what happened prior to this. I would just want to mention that the opposition, since at least 2006, has participated in elections with a unified, in a unified fashion, with a unified platform, with just one candidate for the presidency, with a unified lists of candidates for the different positions. So in 2018, the opposition decided not to participate in the presidential elections. So this has created a very interesting and critical dynamic, political dynamic for the country. On the one hand, the opposition still controls the National Assembly in terms of having won 2/3 of the seats in the National Assembly, and that is clearly the only legitimate branch of power right now. And that allowed the opposition to operate within this institutional framework and allow the opposition to appoint the current president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, as the president and then the interim president. But on the other hand, not participating in the presidential elections of 2018 allowed the opposition to highlight the level of decay of the electoral process in Venezuela, and to also allow and call for the international community to assess the nature of those elections and the nature of the non-democratic character and nature of the regime, which created this very interesting dynamic whereby the opposition has won and controls this very important center of power, which is the National Assembly, but has also been able to convene and to articulate the international community to not recognize the the person who was elected through that phony process in 2018. So I think this is interesting to showcase the very interesting dynamic of the elections in Venezuela, because the opposition considered that participating in the 2018 election was a betrayal of the nature of elections, in the sense that they were so corrupt, so distorted, so intervened, that it was just not allowable for the opposition to participate in those elections. The elected president has not been recognized neither by the international community nor by the domestic community, and that's why the opposition has decided to appoint a new president based on the constitutional rules, that the interpretation of the constitutional rules in regards to the absence of a legitimate legal president. But on the other hand, is using what the opposition achieved through elections, which is the National Assembly. So I think we can go and have broaden this discussion, but I think it's very interesting in terms of the nature of the political process right now, the nature of the transition that the opposition is promoting and leading in the country. And it also allows for an even broader discussion about the use of elections and the significance of elections in this kind of regimes, and how elections can be used both by oppositions and governments in these very strange political regimes that combine elections and authoritarianism, or that in the case of Venezuela combine them until 2015. Now we can say it's a clearly dictatorial regime. However, elections are still playing a very critical role.
Thank you very much, Miriam, for your insightful insights. And it's really interesting how things are going in Venezuela, especially after those so-called elections in May 2018. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts on that. And now I'm gonna turn to Michael Shifter. So we are going to have an assessment on the current situation in Venezuela, and I'm pretty sure he is going to share his thoughts on that. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Geovanny. Thank you all for coming, and it's a pleasure to share the panel with two good friends. And I want to thank NYU and the Brademas Center for hosting this. The current situation is awful. I think that's sort of the starting point. The economic situation, the humanitarian situation, the political situation, there are crises on all fronts. And we could all cite figures, but I think all of us in this room have seen these stunning numbers, and also have seen these terribly sad, dramatic photos. So I think there's no need to go over that terrain. Red Cross is now starting to work in Venezuela, which is a new development that may offer some relief, but certainly very far from what the needs are for a population that is a large share of which is starving to death. So that's the first issue. Second issue is a lot of people continue to leave. 3.5 million have already left in the last couple of years. The flows continue, and nobody that I know thinks they're going to diminish anytime soon. So on the ground is that people are leaving the country because the situation is so desperate. Colombia has been the main recipient of the refugees, but every country in Latin America, the Caribbean, and so forth, are also, and Europe as well. Venezuelans are really going all over because of the gravity of the situation. Politically, things looked really grim in the end of last year, but started to change in January because of two key new factors. One was the emergence of Juan Guaido, who, as Miriam said, is president of the National Assembly and is the only legitimate democratic institution in Venezuela, elected in 2015. And he has proven to be a very effective, appealing, popular figure in Venezuela, and has been able to mobilize Venezuelans on the streets, not just opposition groups, but also many people that had been supportive of Chavez in the earlier period before Maduro came over, and even people that had been with Maduro when he first came in. He has been extremely effective in his message about a future Venezuela, and has somebody that few people had heard of, but really has done extraordinarily well. And so this is in terms of transitions, this is really one of the unique features of this is the importance of the National Assembly and his legitimacy because he was elected. I think we should remember that. The second term, and Miriam referred to this about the elections, is Maduro is known as the usurper. We haven't had, that's not really in the literature, I don't think, but it will be now, because in this case he usurped the position that he was obviously, because his election in May was illegitimate. Guaido has about 60% according to data analysis in the polls, and he is recognized as the interim president by 55 governments throughout the world. Maduro is Nicolas Maduro is Venezuela's de facto leader. He exercises real power. He came into office when Chavez died 6 years ago. He's extremely unpopular. According to data analysis, about 14% in the polls. And according to data analysis, if there were elections, free and fair elections held today, Guaido would get 78% and Maduro 22 in a context between Guaido and Maduro. So that gives you a sense of really which of these figures holds a lot more support and a lot of respect in the country. The reason for Maduro's unpopularity is that the country's in an economic disaster, and also because, as Miriam said, of his dictatorial rule, repression, crackdowns, especially against the poor. And these have been well documented by human rights organizations and other organizations, and it's very, very, very serious. The other issue that's changed since January is the mobilization of the international community, which I know Cindy will talk about in her comments, but it's also means that not only is the united opposition with a strategy and a leader, but there's also a weakened regime that's being pressured externally. So it's the internal strength and the external. And those conditions didn't exist in December of last year. So I think it's important to sort of underscore that. What's the main obstacle in getting where you want to go? That's what you asked me, is sort of how do we get out of this crisis? And the armed forces is still the main issue. The senior levels of the armed forces, remain loyal to President Maduro. The hope was that once Guaido came on the scene and once there was this mass mobilizations and the military saw that Maduro had no support and Guaido had all the support, that they would turn from Maduro to Guaido, and that was the expectation also with the humanitarian, the effort to bring in humanitarian aid on February 23rd. Didn't happen. It didn't happen. So for a variety of reasons, the military is involved in a lot of illicit activities. They've made a lot of money. They run a lot. They have a strong economic interest. They've committed tremendous abuses. And of course, they were, despite appeals from Guaido and even an amnesty law in the National Assembly, they weren't prepared to move from Maduro. So how do we improve the situation? How do we get from this terrible situation to better? Well, I mean, there are a number of different paths. One is that this strategy, which hasn't worked so far, the strategy of the opposition, and I think it's fair to say of the Trump administration, which is that the military would turn, and if the military turns, Maduro collapses because that's the pillar of the regime's support at this point. Still may happen. It's not impossible. It's just that we have to adjust our timetable, that it's not going to happen right away, but it may happen. More sanctions have been applied and there's more pressure, so it's still possible. And that, of course, would be a good scenario. With Guaido, there would be basically follow what he had in mind. It would just happen a little bit later, just be a little bit delayed. The other possibility that's mentioned is some sort of negotiation with the military, especially, that would provide them with some sort of guarantees and protections in exchange for them giving up power. Dialogues have been attempted. A lot of conversations have been going on. Some are very dubious about this, but I think it would be a mistake to give up entirely on the possibility of a negotiated settlement to resolve the crisis. The other possibility is a military takeover. That means getting rid of Maduro, but the military would take charge. Given the emergency situation in Venezuela, they could say, well, we need to stabilize the country. We need to, hold elections. We'll hold elections, not right away, but we need to get things under control. We need to establish order, and then that will enable us to move to elections. And then the question is, what kind of military government would this be? And would it work with the opposition? Would the opposition leaders be part of the government? And that, I think, is a big question mark. There is the talk about the use that's out there in the debate now is the use of force. I think that would be a serious mistake. I don't think it would be a way to improve the situation in Venezuela and could risk triggering a wider regional conflict. So that's my view, in essence, of where we are and ways that out. The title of this session is called The Road to Recovery, which is an optimistic title. It's like there's a river and you're on one side and you want to get to the other side. Once you get to the other side, you could focus on recovery. But first you have to get to the other side. And that hasn't been as easy or as quick as I think many people had hoped and expected. So you still have to go across the river so that Guaido is really in charge, Maduro's out, and he can begin to have a transition government and then call for free and fair elections, which is what you want. But this may take a little time, and there are going to be, I think, a lot of unexpected turns. So this is a long and winding road. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your great remarks and your thoughts. So I think that now there's so much going on in Venezuela, and the most important thing here is that the military remains loyal to Maduro, which I think that is probably the biggest obstacle we have to get to that phase of the recovery. And the crisis down there is really critical. So just keep in mind that there's so many people leaving their country, pursuing freedom, and it's just comparable to the Syrian crisis. So people leaving their country, which makes this a humanitarian crisis. It's not only economic and social crisis. We are thinking of humanity here. So I think that's very important to add. And now I'd like to turn to Cynthia from the Wilson Center. She's going to speak about the U.S. policy toward Venezuela so far, and she will talk also about some external actors such as Russia, United States, of course, Cuba, who knows, among others. Thank you very much for being here. We appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks, Geovanny, for moderating. Thanks to my friends for laying out this situation. Thanks to NYU for the invitation, and to all of you for joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit about U.S. policy and how what that bodes for the immediate and perhaps medium-term future in Venezuela. Also, what are the roles and attitudes of certain external actors, Russia, China, Cuba, in the current Venezuelan crisis. When we think about the international community, at least in Washington sort of context, we think about the Lima Group, the collection of Latin American countries, we think about the European Union, but democratic countries of the West are by no means the only or even necessarily the most influential actors at this point. The United States policy, which began under the Obama administration with a selective number of individual sanctions applied to members of the Venezuelan regime who had either been involved in corruption or in human rights abuses or criminal activities such as narco-trafficking, the sanctions policy aimed at individuals began in around 2015, 2016. The Trump administration has vastly expanded that and has also extended the sanctions to cover many other areas. There are now scores, if not hundreds, of Venezuelan individuals in the government who are subject to individual sanctions. It means either they are under criminal indictment in the United States or have had their visas revoked and cannot travel, and members of their family cannot travel. There was a major escalation in sanctions in August of 2017 when the United States imposed financial sanctions, which made it very hard for not only Venezuelan entities, but also U.S. entities doing business with Venezuelan companies, principally PDVSA, the oil company, to use the U.S. financial system to pay for things like oil shipments. The so-called nuclear option is much more recent. It's the application of oil sanctions against Venezuela, which make it illegal for PDVSA to sell oil to the United States. And mind you, there are a number of international companies. The biggest, I think, U.S. company that was still involved in Venezuela was Chevron. The United States was the largest export market for Venezuelan oil, and the cutting off of those oil sales with a certain number, about a 3-month phase-out period, is going to have a very drastic effect. And it's going to have an effect that grows as these sanctions actually, as they get down to zero, which I think is where they are now in terms of Venezuelan oil exports to the United States. And the real question is, how will those sanctions, how will the bite of those sanctions turn, whether they will turn more in favor of the regime or against the regime. The risks of sanctions, I think, are several. One is that it gives credibility to the government's discourse, rhetoric, that the suffering of the Venezuelan people, the shortages, the dramatic shortages of food and medicine are the responsibility of President Donald Trump. And this is not a consequence of the corruption and mismanagement over so many years, but this sharp decline now in the availability even of food that the U.S. is to blame for that. A second effect, which Michael has already mentioned, will be a dramatic increase in the number of refugees who feel compelled to leave Venezuela. I think that the numbers that we have seen are dramatic in a short period from about 2014, 2015, over about 3.4, 3.5 million. And this will begin to actually destabilize countries of the region, especially Venezuela's most proximate neighbor, Colombia, but also to a lesser but still important extent, Peru and Ecuador, which are simply not equipped to absorb the numbers of people and the numbers of people that come with severe issues of malnutrition and lack of medical attention. So one of the things I actually fear over the medium to long term is the political effect of what these migration flows will be. The region has been extraordinarily generous up until now, astonishingly so. Even in comparison to Europe, which initially welcomed refugees from the Middle East and North Africa, and certainly in stark contrast to the attitudes towards migration being taken by the current U.S. administration. So I think that that we have to be careful when we think of the effect of sanctions as to whether they will ultimately lead to some kind of really sharp division in the regime, in the armed forces, people saying we cannot continue like this, such that we will make a move to change the situation for the better, and versus the opposite, which is that the political effect is exactly counter to what was intended. We have already seen an increase in repression, in the killings and kidnappings and disappearances that are carried out by a specialized unit of the police, the fear of people of torture, the way that military people who are even suspected of plotting have been taken prisoner and subject to torture and other forms of mistreatment. All of these things serve as disincentives over time for people to continue to pour into the streets, for people in the military to contemplate moves towards a coup or some effort to remove Maduro and bring about a change in government. So I am possibly more pessimistic even than Michael, if that's possible. I see the near future as extremely grim. As Geovanny mentioned, and as I mentioned at the beginning, the United States is certainly the most powerful actor, but not the only actor. Russia has a geopolitical strategic interest in the survival of the Maduro regime. The Chinese government, which has lent some $62 billion, not only to the government, but also to PDVSA over the long term, has an interest in seeing those loans repaid, not in money, but in continued flow of oil. The Cubans have an important, I think the most important aspect of the Cuban presence is in the intelligence and military sphere. It has seemed more and more clear that the Maduro regime relies on Cuban advisors to help it keep control within the armed forces and to provide protection physical protection for Nicolás Maduro itself. And the recent arrival of 2 planes from Russia with military advisors, I think, starts to raise the possibility that we are coming to a much more sort of traditional Cold War scenario in which the Trump administration sees the Russian presence as a strategic threat that cannot be tolerated. And I think John Bolton made some pretty categorical comments about 2.5 weeks ago, such that this would not be tolerated. I continue to believe that the prospects that a U.S. military intervention are not necessarily that high, but I also think that people that have gone out of their way, people such as Elliot Abrams, the special envoy, if you will, for the Venezuelan crisis, that we are looking for a diplomatic solution, could be a bit of a smokescreen. And that there are people who are trying at the same time to keep the Venezuelan government off guard by maintaining this threat of a military option. Others are trying to say, no, it's really not the way we're going. We're looking for a political negotiated solution. So I'll sort of end on the likelihood that that's possible. The European Union formed a contact group with some participation of of Latin American countries, Uruguay, Ecuador, Bolivia, and there has been, I think, an effort by the democratic governments of the Lima group to converge with the contact group to see whether there might be some form of a political negotiated solution, some way that this crisis can be ended so as to end the flows of refugees and end the humanitarian crisis and move towards greater democratization. If there is room for cautious optimism, it is that the combination of pressures from the sanctions and a diplomatic path that has at least the acquiescence of the United States could provide some sort of path out of this crisis. But I would be skeptical that this is going to happen in the short and possibly not even in the medium term.
Thank you very much for the wonderful remarks, Cynthia. We really appreciate that. And during these difficult times in Venezuela, the international community should make sure that we all help Venezuela improve the situation there, because it's a matter that it's affecting everybody here. So thank you very much. Now I'd like to have a first round of questions with the panelists, and I'd like to start with Miriam. Miriam, we know that democracy is not the best, the perfect system, but it's the one that works best, right? So we also know that elections are often used by non-democratic governments to create a guise of democracy, because democracy is not always a synonym of elections are not always synonym of democracy. So we like to know, how can we bring back confidence in the Venezuela's institutions and electoral process? How can we create this confidence?
Yeah, thank you, Geovanny. Thank you very much for the question. And I'd like to comment something that is related to this, but maybe something also related to Michael and Cindy's comments. We tend to think that everything started in January and that the opposition suddenly got, re-energized, and, this was a total breaking point. But I think we should also take into account what was going on in 2018 that led to January 2019, which is, it's very related to your question. During 2018, many very interesting things were happening that were maybe not easily perceived. First of all, as I already mentioned, not participating in the May elections was a way of addressing the need for real, solid, transparent electoral processes and democratic institutions in the country. This, the decision of the opposition, as I mentioned earlier, allowed for a better connection with the international community. I mean, the change in the international community in regards to Venezuela was an accumulative process. I mean, especially if we take into account the changes at the OAS when Almagro became the Secretary General, changes in the hemisphere in terms of new governments arising, which changed the correlation of power within the OAS and allowed for a much better alignment and awareness about the nature and the extent of the Venezuela crisis, because the refugee crisis started at least in 2016, 2015, and that already was a very pressing issue in the region. So an important aspect of what happened in 2018 that kind of explains and helps understand what's happening right now is a closer alignment between the international community and the democratic forces in Venezuela that was already happening, but it was closely tied through the non-recognition by a number of countries in the hemisphere and also the European Union of Maduro's election last year. So it's not only that he was not recognized when he took office in January, but he had not been recognized as the president in the past. Secondly, throughout last year, Venezuelan organizations, political organizations, also NGOs, worked in a very systematic fashion to define what now is known as the Plan País, which is the plan, program to recover the country, to address the emergency, the short term, the medium term, and that's something that was brewing and happening last year. It wasn't that visible, I mean, it wasn't making headlines, but it was a very consistent process of bringing together different initiatives to be able to present a thorough and systematic package for recovery, including recovering institutions. And third, another very important aspect, that is the crafting of the document that has served to lead the transition, what's known in Venezuela as the Statute of the Transition, el Estatuto de la Transición, which is a document that the National Assembly crafted throughout last year after the election of Maduro. Because what was the challenge? The Venezuelan Constitution has two very relevant articles, Articles 333 and 350, that establish very clearly that if there is an illegitimate government, an usurpation of power, citizens with or without authority have the right and the responsibility to rebel against this government. So after Maduro was deemed non-legitimate, the challenge was how to turn into an actionable program the non-legitimacy of Maduro. And this became the statute of the transition, which has governed the transition so far, which has laid out like the process and the legal framework, first to not recognizing Maduro, second to appoint Guaido as the president, third to allow for all the decisions that have come out of this government, appointing ambassadors, appointing new directors, authorities to PDVSA, CITGO. I mean, all the actions that the government has taken are within the framework of this statute of the transition, which has turned the Venezuelan transition in a very interesting model, if we can call it, or a very interesting situation, because this is a transition governed by the existing constitution in response to the non-recognition of the constitution by the usurping authority. So it is, and the document itself is very important because it also establishes elements of accountability of the Guaido government, because Guaido can do only what the Constitution allows him to do. And he's the president of Venezuela, the acting president of Venezuela, in the terms of the Constitution. And this document has also set the three-stage roadmap for recovering democratic institutions in the country. End of the usurpation, which means end of Maduro as the usurper of the government. Second, establishing a transitional government. And third, calling for free and fair elections. And it also establishes a limit of time. I mean, from the moment that there is a transitional government until these elections take place, there shouldn't be more than 1 year. So it's also setting limits to this transitional government, and everything within the framework of the Constitution. So they can only do what the Constitution allows them to do. I mean, what the president can do, the ministers can do, the appointed ambassadors, all is in the framework of the Constitution and the existing laws. So this is the path to recover institutions. And this is what is guiding the democratic forces in terms of their project and their engagement with the international community, is engaging with the international community in order to preserve the existing constitution, reestablish democratic institutions and allow for a free, fair election and free, fair, competitive elections in terms of international standards of electoral integrity. So, I mean, that's like the broad framework for, sorry for the long answer to your question, but I think the framework is important in this case.
Thank you very much for explaining the kind of transition that is taking place in Venezuela right now, and especially within the legal framework and taking into consideration what the Venezuelan Constitution states on that issue. So now I'm gonna turn to Mr. Michael Shifter. And Michael, what future do you see of Guaido's movement? What key factors should we be looking for over the next 6 months? And I think this is a question that is for everybody to respond.
Thank you. Well, let me just use the question to respond to what Miriam said, because everything she said is exactly right, and I think it's important to understand the history. Matter of fact, when one day that all of this history is going to be written, the conclusion is going to be that the international response was terribly delayed and weak. Finally, it did come, and it was building, and like you said, it was cumulative. But the point is that Guaido, January is different than December, because all of the opposition leaders were either living in Bogota or living in Spain or under house arrest in Venezuela. And so when I would talk to people from other governments, Latin American governments, European governments, and say, this is just an awful situation. We have to do something. The question was always, they asked me, they said, who's going to take over? What's it going to look like? And they, from their perception, now they may be wrong, and the international perception was wrong, but the perception, I think, was that there was no leadership, there was no strategy, the opposition was divided. And that changed when Guaido came on the scene. And now, again, maybe they were more unified than people thought, but that was the perception. And that was very important, because then governments could say, I could actually imagine an alternative government actually working and taking charge in this country and doing some things. They have a leadership, they have a unity, they're together, they have a strategy, all of that. And that was just such a huge step. Granted, all this other stuff was building up to it, but that just took it to a different level. Look, I mean, to his credit, Guaido, I think, is so far it's a credit, to his skill, a testament to his skill, his capacity, his connection with Venezuelans, that he's been able to sustain these tremendous street mobilizations and pressure on the government. And some have already, had predicted that it would already be weakened, but it hasn't. I think, he continues to do that. Now, I think the thing to look for is really to go back to what Cindy said before, which is that, the situation is probably going to get worse before it gets better, in humanitarian terms and economic terms. And then will people say, Guaido is the president, and my situation is worse. We want results. And it's all the question of timing. The hope was that the results would come quickly. The realization now is that results will take a long time. And if they take a long time, people may get impatient and frustrated. And then they either look to join the others that have left as refugees, or they just focus on their own survival. And they don't really worry about, when do I go out to the street to protest? I worry about preventing myself from starving to death. So that is the challenge. Now, I think he has done it again. I mean, done a terrific job. It's a challenge of managing the expectations and political leadership. And he has a gift, I think. I mean, I haven't met him, but everything I've heard and interviews I've seen, I mean, he's done it so far. Whether he can continue that and for how long remains, I think, a big question. I also think, just if I can comment on Cindy's point about the U.S. would be better served to let Guaido, I think his political sensibilities and skills are better than some of the skills here in Washington. And I think there is a risk of some of the things that's being said about the kind of threatening and ultimatums to the military and so forth that are probably not very helpful to Guaido. So I think the United States should do whatever it can to make things easier for Guaido, not harder for Guaido.
Sure, if I could just elaborate a little bit more on some of those points. You know, you always want to look in your crystal ball and be able to say, you know, what's going to happen. My fear is that desperately hungry people and sick people will not continue over time to pour into the streets. That the repression, not so much by the armed forces, but by the colectivos, these sort of thug, quasi-paramilitary groups, there are people that are tens of thousands of them armed by the regime, and this special force of the police that engages in these kinds of very targeted, selective assassinations, will have a demobilizing effect. And I heard an anecdote the other day, which I don't remember from whom, but two people that had helped put in place the sound system for one of Guaido's, for one of the recent demonstrations were arrested. So the next time, you know, you want somebody to have the, you know, put up the microphone and the speakers at your rally, how anxious are people going to be to do that? Another thing, since, you know, perhaps the video of this will be watched by a student audience, I'd encourage you to look back at one of the sort of classics in the field of understanding insurgencies and rebellions, Ted Gurr's famous book called Why Men Rebel. I think if he were to write that today, he might change that to People, but it was Why Men Rebel. And what he was saying is that it's not the desperately poor, you know, that are motivated to resist authoritarian regimes. It's really people who have had rising expectations or whose, you know, expectations have been dashed. And the question is, you know, when you have had such a devastating, you know, impact via repression, via scarcity and economic need, you know, what will be the possibility over time? And so I think that 2019 is absolutely critical. What happens, what we're able to say in January of 2020, the anniversary of when Guaido emerged as a leader, is going to be really, really critical, because this notion that it's going to take time, well, yeah, and what's going to happen in that time, and, you know, how desperate will people be, and how will they view, you know, the sanctions and the role of the international community, and is there, you know, a really credible search, you know, for an alternative? I mean, I think that those are going to be the critical questions.
Thank you for your comments. And yesterday, I just saw that the U.S. administration announced some sanctions against the Central Bank of Venezuela, in addition to Cuba and Russia. So here's the question: how effective have the sanctions been so far?
Can I just start with that? It's very clear from, I think, repeated statements by National Security Advisor John Bolton and others that Venezuela is not viewed in isolation. Clearly, it has enormous significance in and of itself for what's happening internally and also for the impact on the region. But this rhetoric of the troika of tyranny is not just rhetoric. I mean, I think that people in the administration view Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba as linked, and that you start one place and you can, you know, bring about a democratic or an end to authoritarian regimes in all three places. And the, you know, the use yesterday of the anniversary of the Bay of Pigs invasion and the lifting of the, or the, how shall I say this, the enabling of the aspect of the Helms-Burton legislation that allows U.S. citizens to sue entities, you know, in U.S. court for the expropriation of properties, and the cutting back on, not just the amount of remittances, that's probably not as critical as the curtailment of tourism, whether it's billed as tourism or as study groups or whatever, is going to have, I think, a dramatic impact on the Cuban economy, which is the intended impact. And that the more you threaten the survival of governments, the more they have a tendency to double down on whatever it is that they're doing. And so I personally think that this, these added sanctions are the wrong course, thinking about what might make a Venezuelan transition possible.
Thank you very much. And I want to ask another question, and this one is for everybody to respond if you have something to add. So what type of meaningful support can the international community give to Venezuela at this time, given the fact that there's so much suffering in Venezuela right now, and how we can help rebuild Venezuela physically and emotionally, because it has been so much change, and these people are really suffering now. These people are having a very difficult time. So, and that's the question to the panel for everyone to respond.
Yeah, well, as I think we all agree, the international community was very slow to understand the dimension, the gravity, the extension of the Venezuelan crisis, the extension of the, say, the deterioration of institutional institutions, democracy, rule of law, human rights, and nowadays, I mean, the greatest paradox of this so-called revolution is that in the name of the poor, Venezuelans have become amazingly poorer than they were before. Destitute, completely destitute, and the poorest the people become, the higher the level of control of the people. I mean, so the absolute paradox and the absolute, tragedy of what Venezuelans have gone through is that this regime that was supposed to elevate the quality of life in all respects has only produced the deepest tragedy for Venezuelan people. So the international community has, I think, a very, very important role, first of all, to continue recognizing and understanding what's going on in the country, to really commit to help Venezuela regain democracy, regain prosperity, and to look for all the means, I mean, all the available means to really connect to the suffering of the Venezuelan people, and to look for constructive ways to address this I mean, undescriptible tragedy. So I mean, I think it's it defies the international community. I think this is a situation that is not easy to understand, not easy to handle, and it is a challenge, and it has defied the international community and continues to do so. But I think, I mean, the Latin American community, the hemisphere, has to be even more proactive, explore within the hemisphere what the what the instruments are. I mean, there is the Inter-American Commission, the Inter-American Democratic Charter. I was interested to hear President Lenin Moreno recently talking about the Roldós doctrine. There have been like initiatives in the region, such as in Haiti, the MINUSTA initiative that brought the UN and countries in the region in support for the severe security and security and crisis of Haiti starting in 2004. So I think the region still needs to explore, I mean, what the region did in the past to address massive, emergencies, such as the Haiti emergency, which I don't think Venezuela is far away from that, is far away from that. I mean, what's happening right now, as you said, I mean, this is equivalent to what has happened in Syria without being a country in the middle of a war, a civil war. I mean, the figures are not absolutely clear, but between 3.5 and 5 million people have left the country. That's more than 10% of the population. And that will only continue with lack of food, medicine, electricity, water, basic goods and services, lack of citizen security. There are no incentives to remain in the country. However, I mean, there is a hope. Indeed, Guaido, and I don't dispute the fact that Guaido himself has contributed in an extremely meaningful, personal way to, I mean, re-energize opposition. But he has democratic forces behind him, and he is the expression of the willingness of and the will, I mean, of the democratic coalition in the country. But I mean, there is this very, again, very unique combination of despair and hope in the country. I mean, you see the mobilizations in Venezuela, and they are just amazing. And you see the obstacles, like the most recent mobilization in Zulia, which is the largest state in terms of population that has suffered immensely in terms of power outages because the energy is simply not getting to Zulia, and how Guaido had to bypass all the obstacles, and how they closed bridges, they closed highways to block him from arriving. However, he arrived. The masses that attended these rallies were just impressive. So there is this, I would say, tense coexistence of hope and despair that will not last forever, but it is critical, and it shows, I mean, that despite all the hardship that Venezuelans have suffered, there's still a true, I mean, willingness to fight, even coming from those who are more destitute. So I think that's something that the international community has to take into account. And just a last comment. The international community is critical, is very important. Venezuelans have the feeling that without the international community, they or us will not be able to overcome this situation. But the domestic forces, the Venezuelan people, the domestic coalition is extremely important. We cannot, without the international community, it's not possible to overcome this, but without the Venezuelan people and the democratic forces or the main players in the country either. It's not just about the international community thinking on its own. So, well, again, it's a big challenge, and I think we have to try to use all the existing resources and learn from previous experiences.
Thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more on what you just said. And I think that the reality here is there are so many lessons to learn in Venezuela right now. And just keep in mind that we can apply these lessons to countries like Nicaragua before it's too late for them. So here the question is, in terms of the international community, have any international organizations failed to react to this situation, to this crisis? I mean, international organizations such as the United Nations, for example.
Well, if I could just comment, rather than talk about organizations, I mean, there are three core tasks that I think everybody has to contribute to. One is to relieve the humanitarian crisis inside Venezuela, and also the humanitarian crisis in the countries that are receiving Venezuelan refugees. That is an important task. Second important task is what I think this panel was supposed to be about, which is the recovery, what happens the day after. And there are smart people working on that, and that's also the responsibility, because I think even under the best scenario, you could imagine, if you forced yourself to think of what's the best thing that could happen in Venezuela, a recovery is going to take, what, 10 years, 15 years? Because the country's destroyed. So everybody, I think, has a responsibility to contribute to that. The hardest task, though, that we shouldn't forget about, and this is a big debate, is that we still have to have this, we still have to cross that river. And we still have a regime that's digging in, Cindy said, and so we can't get to the day after until we accomplish that. And sometimes with the United Nations and others, these are competing tasks. And so the United Nations may be reluctant to do the third task of really being on the side of a transition because they are trying to carry out their responsibilities to alleviate the suffering, and they may be in some tension. So that, I think, is the way, at least that I would look at it. But I think in terms of the future, those are the three things, and we shouldn't lose sight that we still have this, as we help people, so they don't starve to death, and refugees, and think about what happens after. We shouldn't forget that we still have this, dictatorship in place that we have to all play an important role in trying to get rid of.
Thank you very much.
There are a couple of things. I agree with everything that's been said. The United Nations, in addition to the Red Cross, is really well positioned and has, in fact, ramped up its presence, and I think will be a great conduit for humanitarian aid in the foreseeable future. There are two things that the United States can do, and again, I don't want to say that this is the equivalent of the international community, but it's the place where we live and can potentially have some influence. One is to be much more forgiving. I don't think this is necessarily likely to happen, but be much more forgiving in terms of the visa status of people, of Venezuelans who are already in this country by granting temporary protected status, but also lifting these terribly restrictive ceilings on refugee admissions to do our part. If we're trying to support Colombia to take in, it's already got 1.3, there's something like another 1 million that are expected to arrive in 2019. Why should only Colombia, our principal ally in South America, be bearing this burden? But probably most important is to realize that sanctions are not an end in themselves. They are a means to an end. And you have to couple that sort of punitive, coercive diplomacy with another form of diplomacy, which is a diplomatic track in search of a solution. And I don't see any indication right now that there is that sort of dual approach from within this administration.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the comments from our wonderful panel today. So now we like to turn to our audience and get some questions and comments from you. So please feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions related to this discussion.
Thank you. So I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned, it's for Cynthia, you mentioned that, the anecdote of the people who were arrested for setting up the sound system for the Guaido event. Today, one of the ships that was involved in the oil shipments from Venezuela to Cuba was not allowed to dock in Miami because it was sanctioned by the US government. So couldn't you say that the role that the sanctions were playing a similar role in deterring people from allying with Maduro? And in that sense, they can lead to a break in Maduro's support abroad, which is in some ways what's keeping him in power. And my other question is, more broadly for the panel, what role can the diplomats appointed by Guaido play in helping first to end the usurpation and then to regain democracy in Venezuela and to lead to those democratic elections?
I'm not sure I understood the question. I mean, I think that the preventing that ship from docking in Miami is exactly what the sanctions are designed to do. The secondary sanctions that have been, applied, prohibit not just Venezuelan oil from coming into the U.S., but also to prevent Venezuelan oil from using any kind of U.S. facility or ship or flag carrier or whatever, to send that oil anywhere else. So I'm not sure I understand what the question was.
My question is whether the sanctions are working in sending the message for the people who would normally be willing to support Maduro or to work with Maduro at least. For instance, Repsol canceled the swap deal they had with Venezuela this morning. So I'm wondering if the sanctions are working in breaking that coalition of support that is behind Maduro up to a certain extent.
Right. Well, it's certainly, I think, been pretty effective in sort of tightening an economic noose around the Venezuelan regime. I'm not sure that the Spanish government needs to be convinced of the importance of a transition, and I would hardly characterize, the European governments that, whose companies still had, interests as being in any way supportive of Maduro. They have private companies or even partially state-owned companies that are trying to protect, their economic assets. The danger, of course, is that Rosneft, the Russian oil company, becomes the only game in town. And in fact, Russia has been helpful in commercializing Venezuelan oil, and it does that without having to violate the U.S. sanctions. So it all comes down to the potentially helpful effects of the sanctions on the one hand, and the negative blowback from the unintended consequences, let's put it that way.
I think that gentleman has a question.
I haven't heard anything about the role of the Organization of American States. That's the first question. And the second question, a related question, is assuming OAS, I suppose the United Nations had the role, could they set up peacekeeper from local country around Venezuela once, of course, you have crossed the river and started the transition?
I'll try that. Well, the Secretary General of the OAS has really taken the Venezuela issue on. This is his, more than his priority, he's totally focused on this, and he's offered a lot of leadership, and I think a lot of leaders of the Venezuelan opposition really respect the role that he has taken and stood up. And I think the OAS as an organization is more complicated because there are a lot of governments, and it's the expression of all the governments, and to get through a lot of the really hard, tough resolutions requires support, including a lot of the Caribbean countries that are so far have been, although that's has changed a little bit, but so far have been pretty reluctant to go along with that. So I think so there's been a certain limit to what the Organization of American States can do, and I think that's one of the reasons why this Lima group that was created in August of 2017, I think, had played a very, very important role and reflects a lot of the major countries in Latin America. But certainly the Secretary General has been out in front on this and has provided a lot of leadership.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the question. Miriam, do you have anything to add to this question before we give the floor to that gentleman over there?
Yeah, I wanted to respond to the question in regards to what can the ambassadors that Guaido has appointed, what can they do? Among the ambassadors that the new government has appointed, there is the ambassador to the OAS, who was recently admitted by the OAS and has already started his role. One thing that this ambassador has already pledged to carry out is to re-include Venezuela into the OAS. Venezuela had already decided to withdraw from the OAS Venezuela will remain in the OAS, and that means also will remain in the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, I mean, within the Inter-American system, which is, I mean, something that is very important. These ambassadors are working in very adverse conditions. I mean, they don't, they still haven't, some of them have, some have not been able to take, take office, I mean, in the full sense of the word, but they are, I had the opportunity to have conversations with, say, someone working in the embassy in Ecuador, for example. They are working hard to alleviate the conditions of the Venezuelans who are already in the different countries in Latin America. They are advocating for easing the conditions, the legal conditions, the documentation requested for Venezuelans. Well, today there was a shipment of humanitarian aid coming from the Czech Republic, for example, and I know that the ambassadors that have been appointed in Europe are also working with the respective governments to also help channel humanitarian aid. They are working to enforce and strengthen the position of the European Union in regards to Venezuela. So they have a diplomatic role. They have a role in regards to channeling humanitarian aid. They will probably have a very important role in the future once we cross the river, which is to open the process for Venezuelans living abroad to register as voters. I mean, there's a very strange situation that reflects the nature of the political process that has taken place in the country, which is the fact that only 110,000 Venezuelans living abroad are registered as voters. However, the amount of Venezuelans living abroad is around 5 million. And when the opposition carried out a referendum in 2017, a self-convened referendum, around 700,000 Venezuelans living abroad voted in this referendum. However, there are only 110,000 registered. So that means that there is a huge, huge gap between those who are registered to vote and the potential of voters. So they will also have a role in identifying how many Venezuelans are living abroad, where, and easing them the conditions to obtain documents, to register as voters. So all of that is being thought at this moment. Little of that specific aspect is being implemented right now, but that's, like a program for the future.
Thank you very much. We all want to cross that river for the good of the people of Venezuela. Please.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. Sorry. This fell down, but it made a lot of noise. Sorry.
That must be a good sign. The river is coming down.
Yeah, the river.
I want to congratulate the moderator for having assembled a truly expert panel, and we're privileged to have listened to the comments. I thought of several things: hope, sanctions, and time. Since we're in an academic setting, a student setting, I thought if I had ever written a policy paper in grad school, where the basis for the recommended policy was hope, I'm sure that Professor Shifter, Professor Arnson would have flunked me, rightfully so. So
Not Professor Kornblith.
well, as well. But to me, on the hope side, it seems I'm astounded to think that the U.S. took the step that it took of actually recognizing Guaido, which is, a step to at least getting into the river. Based on hope, and that now we're like, well, it's going to take more time. So on that score, the first question would be, what is the damage to the U.S.? I mean, you mentioned Syria earlier, and there was the red line of Obama, and that had damage. So next time that the U.S. recognizes, what's the damage to the U.S.? Then, and related to that, how many ambassadors still are part of the Maduro administration. I understand that at the UN, for example, I believe it's still the Maduro, and I'm just curious if you have a number on kind of what's the distribution. And then on sanctions, to try to get into the how much they bite, I wonder if, since I'm not an expert on sanctions, how different are, let's say, the Iran sanctions versus the Venezuela sanctions? And the reason I ask is if how much further, let's say, could the U.S. take sanctions, or how much further has the U.S. taken sanctions in one case versus the other, you know, to kind of have an idea of how far. And then finally, to put you on the spot, time. Are we going to be here, you know, for the next Easter or Passover, still talking about this, or, you know, is it going to be by Thanksgiving, or maybe by, you know, July 4th? When do you see this crossing the river having been completed? I mean, in other words, when is Maduro out? When is Guaido in? And I realize I'm putting you on the spot, and you're going to have to polish that crystal ball, Cindy. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can go. I'll just start. Just on the, I mean, you know, how much damage the United States? The United States is still the United States, and you know, it's important in any scenario, positive scenario in Venezuela, simply because of the weight that it carries and power and so forth. And obviously, this is a priority, whatever the motivation is of the administration. It's, you know, maybe a troika of tyranny, and maybe that's the wrong way to frame it, so forth. But there's no question that most of the people who work on Latin America in the U.S. government are working on Venezuela. That's the chief challenge. I do think, you know, I mean, I said this when it happened, that when January 23rd, I just thought it was completely wishful thinking that somehow all of this would, you know, all of this would happen according to plan, according to hope, as you say. They got it wrong. I mean, that's the bottom line. They got it wrong. Does that mean that, you know, they're not going to play a role in the future? No. But it was not, you know, they just, I think there are reasons to question their strategic, you know, sense of reality. There's always this hope that things will change, as you said, and a lot of wishful thinking, and I just thought it was a fantasy. I mean, I hoped, I joined them in the hope. I shared the hope, but I just think, I thought it was very unlikely to happen. So, and then I think, you know, there are problems with, you know, saying all options are on the table all the time. People interpret that military is still being actively considered, whether it is or not. That's the way people interpret that phrase. I'm not sure that that's helpful. I'm not sure that it's important. I'm not sure it's important to hold together the coalition that's been forged on Venezuela. It's a major asset for the United States, just, you know, in contrast to other places in the world, actually to be part of a coalition in Latin America and major European countries. That comes at risk to the extent that we hear this kind of language and threats directed to the Venezuelan military. The Venezuelan military may be corrupt and may be criminals, but they're not stupid. They know that the United States, if it needs to use force, will use force, and it knows that it's a superpower and has the strongest military in the world. I mean, to repeat it, I don't think it's... So it's made a lot of mistakes, but I don't think it takes it out of the game at all. And I think there's still, you know, without the United States, I think prospects would not be as good. And so, and then your final question on the crystal ball. It's very hard to know, but I think my sense is where things are going, as I said in my initial comments, is that I think a year from today, we're probably not going to see either Guaido or Maduro as being in effective control of Venezuela. I think we may see some, you know, military official or some other official, and then, you know, we may eventually see Guaido. But I think again, the question, as you said, the question of time. I don't think a year from now this kind of plan of a transition is gonna happen. It may happen after that, but not now. That's kind of my sense. But I also don't think Maduro could hang on, although he's been underestimated, and that could happen as well.
Thank you very much. Now, I think we still have two questions.
Yes.
Actually, three questions.
Yeah.
One from the middle, and
And very briefly,
Yes, please.
regarding the ambassadors, I mean, as far as I understand, the Guaidó government is planning to appoint ambassadors to all the countries that have recognized him as the legitimate government. So it's like 54 countries, I think. So I don't know if all of them have been appointed, but at least half of them, or maybe more. And yeah. And I mean,
No.
one thing I think we have to take into account, and this kind of, I mean, it's related to what Michael just said. The Maduro government is very isolated internationally, is very isolated domestically. The sanctions have had a very strong impact in terms of his domestic alliances. We hear every day someone fleeing the country, coming here to the U.S., collaborating with the services here in terms of providing information about corrupt dealings, narco trafficking, this whole kleptocratic scheme that siphoned the resources from the country. All of that is being reported. How? Because there have been a lot of people who are collaborating here in the US and elsewhere. So his initial, I mean, he had a Chavismo had a huge coalition. Maduro's coalition was smaller than, at the beginning of his government, smaller than Chavez, but it was still a very meaningful coalition. Nowadays, it's basically the heads of the military, because at least 200 mid-level officials, and not only mid-level, there are also generals who are in jail because they oppose the Maduro regime. At the rank and file level, the army is almost depleted in terms, because so many have fled the country, so many have just resigned from the army. So the army has become almost an empty shell in terms of personnel. Those who have remained control forces, control weapons, but as an institution is totally, it is significantly weakened in terms of an institution. In terms of political support, even his own party, the PSUV, is not responding as a party. You can see also the military have been substituted by all these thug groups and colectivos, because the military itself is not responding in terms of massive repression. So, and I'm not just trying to present things in a nice, optimistic way, but it is the reality is that all of these sanctions, pressure, isolation, and of course the terrible situation of the country has had a damaging impact on Maduro's coalition and Maduro's ability to perform beyond the basic repressive actions that he's been taking in the past days. I mean, the governability, the ability of the government to govern, to provide basic goods and services, to ensure minimum standards of living, not only for the whole population, but to those who they have defined as their main stakeholders in terms of those who are closer to the government and provide some level of support, has diminished significantly. So, I mean, I think all of this is having an impact. As Michael has said, and Cindy, maybe the initial estimates were totally off and totally not based in reality, that this would just crumble immediately. But it's difficult to know how long this would take. I think one critical moment is 2010, when the National Assembly will end its term. And that's a landmark. I mean, that's a critical moment.
2020.
What did I say?
2010.
Oh, sorry, 2010. I think elections in the U.S. will also set a limit. but there are so many unpredictable elements that are associated with the Venezuelan people. I mean, and those who are supporting Maduro, at some point they will say no more. I mean, and we've seen that elsewhere. The military supports the government until they stop supporting it, and that happens. And that's the combination of many, many factors. So I don't think we have the ability to predict when, but I think we all agree that the situation is getting worse and worse, and it is generating a very significant pressure on Maduro himself.
That's very true.
Yeah.
So regarding the sanction question, I think that, I mean, I'm not an expert on sanctions, but I think I have to point out that when it comes to countries, every country has its own religion context, you know what I mean? Its own history also, and culture too. So I think we need to see everything, you know, in a different way, because we cannot come with like a unified recipe for all the countries, if I made myself clear on that. But I'm pretty sure that Cynthia is going to add something to that question.
Well, let's see. Alex, one of the key parts of your question was how do the Venezuela sanctions resemble Iran? I'm not sure I have the expertise to say that, but it's a very important question to see how much more they can be applied to third parties, which was clearly the intent of the Iran sanctions. One sort of trivia note is that India, which was the third largest purchaser of, or cash purchaser of Venezuelan oil, increased its purchases of Venezuelan oil as a result of the Iran sanctions. So, you know, there are all these processes of unintended effects, but that was one of them in the case of India. I'm not sure I can say anything more about the crystal ball, but I would like to say that when regimes go into survival mode, they get more and more dangerous. And another aspect that we've touched on in a variety of the comments, I think also needs to be highlighted, which is that the criminal economy in Venezuela is enormous. And the use of Venezuelan territory for drug shipments and whatever is just up there. But Venezuela not only is rich in oil, it's rich in gold and coltan and diamonds and whatever. And you could see a lot of wealth being generated, you know, just through trafficking and other kinds of illegal means.
Thank you, Cynthia. I think we have a few questions, one from the middle and another on the left. So.
My question is about the sanctions and the basis of the sanctions. As I understand it, the sanctions on individuals were authorized by an act of Congress that said that individuals in Venezuela who did human rights violations could be sanctioned by the president. But as I understand it, the financial sanctions on the government of Venezuela and the state oil company are due to Obama's determination in 2015, an emergency order because Venezuela posed an extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. And there are only a couple countries that have that determination, like Iran and North Korea. The financial sanctions are not authorized to cause a regime change or you know, the return of democracy. They're to deal with an extraordinary threat to the security of the United States. Is that an accurate characterization of the basis of the sanctions? And how have they segued into this, you know, taken for granted that the sanctions are here to oust Maduro? I thought the administration for a long time said these sanctions are not about regime change, and now it seems that they are.
The authority that allows the president to declare sanctions, as you say, is defined by Congress. And when the Obama administration initially imposed these individual sanctions, it did so according to the letter of the law, which required a determination that a country was a threat to the national security of the United States in order to invoke the president's authority to apply those sanctions. I think there was a lot of criticism of President Obama at the time, and the defense of the administration then was that this is not the way we would have chosen to do it. We don't see Venezuela as a national security threat, but this is the way that Congress has written this legislation. I would say that the Trump administration clearly sees Venezuela as a threat to not only the United States, but to the Western Hemisphere because of the levels of illegal activity, not because of the violations of democracy, but because of the illegal activity and also more and more the activities of Russians and Cubans and others.
Thank you very much. We have another question, but before, let me tell you that Michael needs to leave now.
No, I just think.
I do need to leave.
Okay, great. So we are about to wrap up, and let's
One
just
last question.
yeah, one last question.
Great. Well, thank you all for your enlightening perspectives today. A quick two-part question. First is, can we rule out a protracted Cold War scenario a la Cuba for Venezuela? And if so or if not, is there any way that the international community, specifically Organization of American States or United Nations, can work with some of the nefarious actors here to deliver humanitarian aid and medicine, such as Russia, China, and potentially even Turkey on an exile package for Maduro? Thank you.
I would say on the first question, anything's possible. I want to rule out anything. I mean, there are a lot of echoes of the Cold War of what's developing. This is, Venezuela is a piece on the global chessboard, as Cindy talked about. All of these actors are involved. I think one has to understand the involvement of Russia and China in terms of also U.S.-Russia relations, U.S.-China relations. It's all connected. And also to understand in terms of U.S. domestic politics. I mean, there are a lot of pieces to this. But I think that's not out of the question. I mean, if it depends how important Venezuela is for the Russians and the Chinese, and I think we've gotten mixed signals, but so far they're backing Maduro. On the second question, I don't see the situation's so polarized, and certainly OAS and the Secretary General have taken such a strong, clear stand that I don't see any possibility of any kind of working with some of the nefarious actors to work out some sort of agreement. I think there's just enormous mistrust there.
Thank you, Michael. I just don't want to leave this discussion without having our panel tell us if there was any policy recommendation that you will make to help Venezuela improve or recover from this crisis and look forward to stability and peace. What would it be? And this question, this policy recommendation can go to the international community, to Venezuela itself, or to outside actors. And I think that's how we are going to wrap up this discussion. Just leaving this place with one recommendation from each of you.
Getting rid of the Maduro government. I mean, there's no other way to make any significant progress in the country. I mean, so if that's a policy recommendation, that's the basis of I mean, any path towards a better future.
That's the river.
Well, in that spirit, I agree. I think for the U.S. not for the U.S. to take the lead, but to encourage the most potentially serious path towards a serious negotiation, a meaningful negotiation, not what the pointless dialogues that happened before. And I think it can be done. I think it's difficult, but I guess my recommendation is not to give up on that possibility.
Thank you.
And I would just echo that the most important thing that the United States government could be doing now is to accompany the pressure via the sanctions with a serious diplomatic track. And I think that is completely absent from this administration's conception of what needs to be done in Venezuela.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Let's thank our panel for being here, and thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you.